The Icons of Real Estate podcast. Are you ready to learn the proven money-making secrets from top-producing icon agents? Ready to skyrocket your business? This podcast is for you. Tune in every week with your host, Tomasz Fonseca, and find out how to implement proven strategies to 10 times your business, from $3 million to $30 million in just 12 months. Brought to you by the Masters at Real Estate Marketing, Ardor SEO.
Welcome to Icons of Real Estate podcast. I'm your host, Patty Teal. Let me tell you about today's guest. It's Matt Slepin. Matt founded Terra Search Partners in 2006, which merged with the ZRG Partners. Terra ZRG is a global search firm which brings together their clients and candidates for the purpose of building great organizations. And they definitely play a role in shaping the future of the real estate business. Welcome, Matt.
Hey, thank you. Thrilled to be here.
Such a pleasure to have you. Now, I know that you host a wildly popular podcast called Leading Voices in Real Estate. And so usually you're asking other people their story, but today I want to hear your story. You know, when did it begin? How did it move through whatever you did before into where you are now?
Sure. Well, so I've been a real estate professional for the 40 some odd, I don't want to give the exact number, 40 some odd years of my career. I fell into real estate. I did a little bit of everything back in Washington, D.C., where I lived when I got started in the business, spent about 25 years there doing different roles, culminating in running a group called the Multifamily Housing Institute, which was kind of a think tank for the apartment industry, and an early mover on creating a national database of performance in the apartment industry, if that makes any sense.
It does.
And then my wife had a corporate relocation to San Francisco from Washington, D.C., and I was what we in the business call a trailing spouse. And at age 40, after spending 20 some odd years in the business, I needed to reinvent myself and figure out what to do because I had a fairly Washington, D.C. centric background, and I was running a trade group or a think tank, which didn't really translate to something I could do in the West Coast. And somehow I fell into recruiting in the real estate business. And that was about 25 years ago, and started it. And as I like to say, this is a biblical reference, but I was somewhat like the Jews wandering through the desert in the Sinai with my career, that it didn't really come together, didn't really make sense. And then all of a sudden it gelled when I became a recruiter 25 years ago, and it was the best move I ever made.
Oh, that's so great. I know I've noticed sometimes when you do something new, it's just like you realize that all the things you did before kind of helped prepare you for it.
100%. And the things I had done before actually made me a really good recruiter because I had struggled a little bit, so I had empathy for candidates.
Sure.
I'd kind of done many different roles in the real estate business, so I understood the different real functions within institutional real estate. And I kind of knew how to network, and I knew how to create relationships with people. But that was bread in the bone. I didn't know I had that skill so well until I kind of got into this kind of role.
Right. And you go, wow, I'm really good at this. So
Yeah.
So who are your clients? I think I read that you have small clients and you have super large clients. How did they find you and who are they?
Yeah. So first of all, the work that we do is somewhat distinct from the typical listener that you have, because I think your show is largely geared to real estate agents and residential salespeople. We don't do any of that side of the business whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
Although when I tell the man on the street that I'm a real estate headhunter, they go, "Oh, you go find real estate agents."
Mm-hmm.
That's not what we do. We work
Ah.
largely for major institutional owners and financiers and investors in income property. So office buildings, apartment buildings, warehouses, retail centers. The larger owners of those kinds of properties have, of course, entire teams that acquire, manage, invest, and report to investors, and everything else, develop, build, in the food chain of that business. And so those are our clients, and we find executives for those clients, maybe a CFO or a head of acquisitions
Yeah.
or a chief investment officer or an asset manager or head of property management. And we do that around the country with that diversity of different types of owners.
Well, you must meet with some interesting people too.
Well, we do. And, luckily I'm someone who loves what I do. So I just thoroughly enjoy in a search. We have an assignment, say, for a CFO. My colleagues and I probably reach out to 250 people, touch with them in order to narrow it down, to find candidates.
Mm-hmm.
And I might interview 10 people, my client might interview 5 people. And then we wend our way through a process for a client to hire the one person.
Right.
And one of the sales things, because your listeners think about sales, is one of my questions to my team is, we talk to 250 people, one person gets a job.
Yeah.
How do we make friends with the 249 people who either are giving us ideas or we're networking with or interviewed and didn't win? How do
Right.
we make friends with those 249 people while the one person gets the job? And there's a beautiful, wonderful trick about that. But if you come into a business with that attitude, it's like you're a sales broker on a residential home and the runner up for that property didn't win. Well, they're your next client, of course. So how do you make the runners up your best friends?
Yeah. How do you?
You're smart, you know what you're doing, you're a consummate professional, you treat
Mm-hmm.
people that way.
Right.
And if you always come from that place, and you always come from a place of generosity and self-interested generosity,
Mm-hmm.
then I think the world works out pretty well.
Yeah. And there may be another position that comes up that they're
Of
perfectly
course.
suited for. So
Well,
that's
that's our next
mm-hmm.
client and that's our next candidate in my business. But there's
Right.
lessons there for every business, pretty in real estate or elsewhere in the economy.
Yeah. So these large corporations that work with you, are they on a retainer generally?
Yeah, so there's two kinds of search. One kind of search is called contingent search, and that's for kind of lower level people, property management people, site level people. Administrative assistants are largely done by contingent recruiters, and retained search is really a consulting assignment. And
Right.
so if I'm looking for a CFO, I don't, and also the client might hire multiple contingent recruiters at the same time to say, hey, go throw me some resumes.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't throw resumes, we thoughtfully position and place people. But on a retainer assignment for a CFO, you have one consultant, they work with you, a consultant meaning recruiter. We're paid a retainer, we're paid money no matter what happens in the process. And we're off to the races on what usually is a 3-4 month consulting assignment. So the way I look at it is if I do 5 at a time, they own a fifth of me during the period of time, during the life cycle of my search.
Right, right. Oh gosh, that must be so fascinating. Do you spend a lot of time looking for people on LinkedIn? Do they generally find you? How do you find these candidates?
Yeah, so the first thing is this is not the answer to your question, but it's just funny is, every day I
Hmm.
get half a dozen resumes from people who just send in a resume. Hey, I hear you're a big time headhunter.
Hmm.
I'm looking for a job. And that's a cold call and usually goes nowhere
Right.
because at a given time, I have a shopping list of, a dozen searches or whatever the number is. And usually that resumes that come in don't fit that. And
Hmm.
also usually the resumes that come in aren't that interesting. So we're really, but I do have a big network. That's my job. And so I know significant people in each of the sectors of real estate, kind of at all times. And when an assignment comes in to do something, I immediately have ideas and I have context and a strategy
Right.
for how to go find people that might fit that job.
Hmm.
And what we do is LinkedIn and the web, of course, has changed the world. And during my search career, at the beginning, the web didn't really have, that was 25 years ago in the dark ages. You couldn't go to a company's website and figure out who worked there. Of course, now you generally can, particularly at the top
Hmm.
level, which is where we work. And then LinkedIn makes things quite transparent.
Hmm.
But that makes the easiest part of the job more thoughtfully done. So we
Right.
can all find candidates. Every search person, we have strategies and ways to do that. The more interesting thing is to get a candidate interested in a job. And the more interesting thing than that is to figure out a candidate who is interested in whether or not they're worthy of that job. Are they the right person? How do we figure that out? What's that interview process and interactive process look like? And then if I think someone's good for a job, how's my client figure that out? How do I help my client figure that out? They're not a professional interviewer, I am.
Mm-hmm.
And so we guide them through the process of having choice, hopefully having 3, 4, 5 viable candidates,
Mm-hmm.
all worthy candidates. And how do you select among them? And so the
Right.
real thoughtful process, the real thoughtful part of search is around that.
I imagine.
Much
Mm-hmm.
more than casting the net and finding bodies.
Mm-hmm. Do you get emotionally attached to who gets the job? You have your favorite, and do you get disappointed when they choose someone else?
It's an interesting question. In rare occasion, do I have a favorite? Well, first of all, I generally kind of fall in love with all my candidates. If I've had,
Ah,
let's say there's half a dozen candidates, I have a
mm-hmm,
viable pathway for each of them. I kind of
mm-hmm,
believe in each of them. I could handicap who might be the best or who might be liked the most,
right.
but I can't, I don't like everybody. So that's not, there's people I go, oh gosh, I don't love that person if they get the job.
Mm-hmm,
But sometimes I have a favorite and I'm attached to that. And I sell that a little bit to the client, not for my goals, but for their goals. Right? Because my
yes.
opinion, they're going to live with this person and have a relationship. Um, so it's totally up to them. If I get 5 viable candidates, each of whom could do the job, one of the
Mm-hmm,
words I like to use, expression, is each of the candidates are real. They could all do the job, and each presents a different version of your company's future, particularly if we're looking for a CEO. And what do
mm-hmm.
those different versions of your company's future pathway look like with each candidate? And how do you live with feeling that different potential outcome based on a person? And I kind of look at people that way. It's a little bit awkward and odd. And so I fall in love with each of them in some ways, and I'm an
Mm-hmm.
advocate for each person in different ways.
It is so interesting, Matt. I really never thought of the depth that you would go through to pick a CEO, but of course it could change the whole course of the company. So this is a huge decision, and I imagine it takes quite a bit of time.
It does. And the most interesting part, again, if you get, again, thinking about the 4 or 5 candidates or 2 or 3 candidates, it's the end of the day is how does the client figure them out? How do they go through a process? And even though I interview people for a living, I don't entirely believe in interviews. So how do you get them out of interview
Ah,
mode, out of
sure.
interview skin? Everyone knows kind of what they're supposed to do in an interview. So how do you get to see them behave? How do you test them?
Mm-hmm.
How do you test them in different ways? How do you put them in situations and circumstances to share their knowledge in a more natural way than an interview environment? And we try to pull that into the search process, particularly for higher level assignments.
Maybe you don't do this because you're working on such a high level, but I recall, having these tests. Which one describes you most? Considerate,
Mhm.
fun? You have to rank them.
Right.
And it seems so silly. Like, how could this help them choose a candidate? But maybe it's not. Do you believe in different kinds of personality tests or these kinds of things to help you choose a candidate?
Absolutely. And it's
Oh.
so we at ZRG, we administer, different tests. So we use
Uh-huh.
those tools and help them to make decisions. And so again, if you get back to, okay, here's 4 candidates who are all qualified on paper and qualified personality wise, you've gone through a couple of interviews with them. Now, how do we further differentiate these people? And you could do a DISC test or a PXT test, which we use in CRG, or others. And those tests provide additional insights to people's behavior patterns, their strengths and weaknesses, and the way they're going to show up to work. And it's another data point that I think really matters. If you use that data point solely, then I think you're silly. But
Mm-hmm.
if you use that data point to help understand someone better, to know how they're going to behave with you, hey, here's 4 great candidates. I like this one the best. Now, what do I need to know? Being forewarned is forearmed. How am I going to interact best with them? How am I going to make them the most successful? And these tests really help you to figure those things out and to not hire someone who's going to drive you crazy after a week, because that exists in the world too.
It's really interesting. So it's just one more tool on top of all the other things that you're doing.
That's right. And, references, they mean different things. And references are usually, I'll give a dirty secret, they're usually worthless, because what everyone will tell you about, you get their reference list and you call their references, the only word they know is good. Oh, they're good. They're good. They're really good.
Well, they wouldn't have put them on the list, I'm sure, otherwise.
Right. So how do you get below the surface to figure out the truth about people? And references are really important when you can get a good one and an honest one, and someone who's going to help you figure out, hey, I don't know how to do a left-handed layup, but I could do a right-handed layup really well. Well, the job requires both sides of the basket, to take shots at. And so how do you get to understand what those people's tendencies are? And references will really help you to do that. Again, all worthy candidates. Right. And sometimes they have Achilles, and you need to know what those Achilles are, and they're hard to discover until you start working with them and you go, oops, there's an Achilles.
Yeah.
Or there's an Achilles I didn't know about, because everyone has one.
Everybody has one, yes. What about company culture? So maybe the company that hired you is a group of millennials, and you want to find somebody that would fit in. Do you take that kind of thing into consideration as well?
Absolutely. So I look at two sides of what I try to discover in an interview with a candidate. And we can talk about interviews on the podcast, which is similar but different, right? So with a candidate, the first thing is I have some objective things I want to find out. Do they, if it's a CFO, are they a good accountant? Do they understand real estate tax? Do they understand real estate partnership accounting? Can they manage a team of accountants? Are they sophisticated from a financial standpoint? And those are fairly objective things that you can discover from their background. On the other side of the ledger are the subjective things that you want to intuit. I don't ask a direct question, what's your management style, which a lot of people will ask that, because I don't believe they'll tell you the truth. I'll tell you what I think my management style is, but if you ask my people, they'll tell you what my real management style is, and I'm totally unaware of.
Right.
So I'm intuiting the kind of person they are. I'm also intuiting the kind of organization that I'm representing. And then collaboratively with the client, we're together finding data points to think if they're going to be a fit or not. And I'm expressing a fair amount of fuzziness on this question that you asked, and maybe a little insecurity, because I'm not saying I am the Oracle of Delphi, knowing what someone's cultural fit is going to be.
Sure.
But if you put me together at the table with a client and 3 or 4 people from the client and a bunch of interactions with the candidate over 3 or 4 rounds of different types of interviews, then all of a sudden that cultural fit becomes pretty clear. And I'll be really opinionated to help draw out the meaning and the discoveries in the search process with the client on those cultural fit issues.
Right. Yeah.
So again, two sides of the ledgers. Do they have the skill set? Pretty easy, not easy, but do they have skill set? And then do they fit well? And how much better or worse is their fit with other people?
That makes sense.
And last comment to this, I have so many things to say all the time.
Oh, just keep going.
If a company says our culture is this and we only hire people who are that way, that's a danger sign too, because companies want to have flex in their modus operandi. And so you don't want to hire everyone who's the same.
That makes sense.
But you still have a corporate culture. So there's a balance there as well.
Yeah. So it's good to have the variety and bring in people that have a different perspective, or maybe you're not just like everybody else that works there, but on the other hand, they have to fit in. So you've got that seesaw that you need to balance.
And I also think of the word yin and yang. So if I'm hiring a CFO, maybe the CFO has got to be the yang to the yin of the CEO. So I'm trying to intuit what the CEO's style is so that I can find not their carbon copy for the CFO, but their yang for the CFO, because they complement each other well, and there's blind spots that the CEO has that they really want that CFO to do.
So just like partnership, sometimes it's very helpful if one has skills that the other doesn't have.
Of course.
Yeah. So when there are several rounds, you would say generally for a high position, CFO, CEO, there are several rounds. And how
Always.
does it kind of narrow down the rounds? Does the big boss not get involved until the very end? How does that work?
Oh, it totally depends on the situation. Sometimes the
I
big
see.
boss is my client. Sometimes HR is my client, although not
Right.
usually.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's a hiring manager if we're a couple levels down, and then they do or don't involve other people in the search. And it depends on the level. When you're talking about a C-suite role, then there are multiple parties, multiple clients, maybe even the board of directors oftentimes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's different than I'm finding, one of three acquisitions people to join a company. That's more a plug and play job.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of things we're talking about apply more to the higher level positions than they do to the plug and play person.
Yeah. So in this day and age, are most of the interviews done via Zoom or something like
Uh,
it?
yeah, of course. I never do a phone interview, and Zoom made it so that probably no one does phone interviews anymore because it's so much better to look people in the eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And Zoom is looking people in the eyes. I think for me, this will sound like a funny trick, but my biggest trick is to spend more time than less time. And it's the moments in between the questions and the silences, and come out in an interview if you spend 90 minutes, and they don't come out if you spend 45 minutes, because you got to get through all the points in 45 minutes. And in 90 minutes, there's a lot of extra space and other things that don't really seem relevant, but they are relevant. And you discover them in the other 45 minutes of investment, if that makes sense. And Zoom is quite good at that. You're missing a couple of data points. How do they greet you in person?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anyone has bad breath anymore. I used to know that. I'm sensitive to that one.
You're very funny, Matt.
But on Zoom, you don't know. You don't know if they smoke. I'm like a prejudiced person about smokers. I hope that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't piss off any of your
Well, me too.
listeners.
I just can't be
Right.
around
And
that.
so
Yeah.
I may not hire that kind of person for a client, and the client may not want to do that, but I can't tell that on Zoom, those things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so, but it's Zoom is great.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if our listeners are candidates for any of the jobs that you represent, but can you give some tips to the person who really is after a high level job, how they can make a great impression?
Yeah, let me change the subject, and then let's answer the question, though, because
Absolutely.
it's really
Mm-hmm.
it's really interesting. If I'm thinking about the world of real estate agents, which is really, I believe, your listening audience, the question, your listening audience, that's a very entrepreneurial business.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a business where you get a seat at a desk and then you build a career.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also a business where what I usually call it the 80-20 rule, but I think in real estate brokerage, it's the 95-5 rule, where 95% of the people are just treading water and doing this because it's a nice way to make a living.
Mm-hmm.
And 5% of the people are going to do really, really well. I want to use the word they're killers, but that's a negative word. But I
Mm-hmm.
think they're going to make a lot of money and really shine in the business.
Right.
And I think similarly in that business, how do you become one of those 5% of the people? And it's your goals, and it's and it's your drive, it's your
Mm-hmm.
intelligence, it's all kinds of things. And those are some of the things that are also relevant in interviewing for, a chief investment officer role at an institutional real estate company.
Mm-hmm.
No one who's in the real estate residential brokerage business is going to interview for the things that I'm hiring for, because this is institutional real estate and you need a lot
Right.
of experience to have been
Mm-hmm.
buying big commercial properties or big apartment properties or whatever it is. But I think a lot of the skills, a lot of the drive are things that are there and want to be shown and demonstrated. So you demonstrate those things in an interview that you actually demonstrate when I described before about how do you treat the person who was second place in buying a home.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yes.
think the trick there is, right, that behavior is the same behavior that drives exceptional performance, whether and how do you show that behavior and that personality in a job interview? So I'm trying to draw a parallel between two things that aren't really connected, but in some ways I
But
think they are.
everything is connected, I think. And so I'm wondering if someone has been a CEO or a CFO, but it's a different industry, but they've got great experience, great intelligence. They could probably sink their teeth into the job and do a great job. But of course, there'd be a learning curve because they haven't been in institutional real estate. Would they be someone that would be considered for a position?
Generally not whatsoever. Just to be
Okay. Yeah, no,
just to be clear.
Curious, yeah.
It does happen. We
Mhm.
skip outside of industries for generalists. Oftentimes in the early days of the REIT business, the real estate investment trust business, where the public companies, we didn't have history in that business 20 years ago. We didn't have
Mhm.
deep bench.
Right.
And we didn't have deep bench of companies. We didn't have people with experience in public real estate companies. So we really did pull from outside the industry. And in a given location, I go broad. So if I'm looking in Chicago for the CFO of something, I will talk in Chicago to CFOs from other industries, and it sometimes works. Maybe 20, 30% of the time you have that as an outcome. That's pretty low percentage. If I'm moving that CFO from Chicago to San Francisco to be the CFO of a public real estate company in San Francisco, now I have like double, triple the risk factors.
Mhm.
Because will they like real estate? Will they like San Francisco? Will their spouse like San Francisco?
Right.
So those risk factors make it such that tends not to work. So it's really only, for me, local market people tend to be the people who skip over industries.
Mhm.
And then the other thing is usually we have people who are pretty well oriented to the different businesses in real estate. And again, if I'm looking, say, for a CFO, which I keep talking about because I'm doing a
Right.
bunch of those right now,
Yeah.
I want someone who understands the tax, has a deep understanding and knowledge of tax and real estate, has deep knowledge of real estate partnership accounting. There's all
Mhm.
kinds of technical stuff.
Oh, sure.
And someone who is in manufacturing or an operational CFO probably
Mhm.
can't do that. So
Very.
it just situationally depends.
Wow, I so feel like I'm getting the inside track. So fascinating. Now, I know the world is changing. We talk about Zoom and interviews being done that way. On such a high level job, is there a percentage of companies that will hire remote employees that maybe just fly in occasionally for meetings?
Yeah. And so first of all, we have to distinguish popular culture hiring and the average hire from a C-level hire.
Mm-hmm.
And so for average level hiring, Google hires a bazillion people a year.
Right.
They're not all coming into the office to do something.
Sure.
They're doing a lot of testing.
Mm-hmm.
And the wisdom around resume writing, the wisdom around interview techniques that you read in the popular press applies to the 95% of the jobs out there that may be filled remotely without ever interacting with someone, that are filled in part by computers or deciding who they want to interview.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't apply at the most senior levels,
Right.
right? So the popular wisdom about how to write a resume has nothing to do with that. That means how to get through the gatekeeper of a
The box, yeah.
computer
Right.
to have
Mhm.
someone say, "Hey, we like your resume. Let's take a look at this."
Right.
But at the higher level world, most candidates don't go through the computer to get interviewed. They go through a relationship or a connection or a headhunter to get an interview.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, the rules are totally different in that dynamic. And it's the same for interviews, and it's the same for remote interviews versus non-remote interviews. In the middle of COVID, or the beginning of COVID, we did a fair amount of placements where people had never met each other.
Mm-hmm.
So that did happen. I just hired someone I've never met on my team. He's a wonderful
Mm-hmm.
guy. We did a lot of work together. We spent a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of ways to get to know each other, but then we finally met a week after we hired him a couple of weeks ago. So you're using all these techniques, but for me, the most important part is, do you have some face-to-face interviews at a C-level job? Do you get to know the management team? And it's not just, think of interviews as a two-way street.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just an interview for us to choose whether we want you or not.
Right.
Equal part of the interview is for the candidate to choose whether they want the company or not. And how
Yes.
does the company shine in that process? And that's really important to think of. You're both buying and selling at every moment, both the candidate and the company, about a
Mm-hmm.
job.
Right.
So not all that can be done remotely, particularly for high level positions. And it's too big a process and too big an investment for a C-level person to just fully hire them remotely,
That makes sense.
if you can help it.
Right. So do you use job listings? Are there times when you post these jobs, or pretty much you individually reach out to people?
We mostly, again, think of the hierarchy of positions. If we're in the C-suite or EVPs and SVPs and all that, it's really outreach. We do post, but I will tell you that when you do sometimes we post because we really have to cast a very wide kind of crazy net. But those are all for mid-level jobs.
Got it.
Not for the seniorist jobs, those people. And also we're yanking people out of happy positions.
I thought you probably did that. Yes.
That's right. I think of the dentist. This is not, sometimes people are a loose tooth. Sometimes they're an impacted molar, and you really need to drag them out. And so how do you get them interested in the job, even though they're kind of happy or whatever the situation? So it's not a posting.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you hired someone new on your team, I believe. So who do you have on your team? What types of assistants do you get?
ZRG has like 800 people, or I don't know my number. I should know this, but I think, I think we're global and we have a lot of folks. Our real estate practice has about 20 people at ZRG. At Terra, we had 12 people. And so, we have a team of partners that are across the country, indeed across the globe, and we have associates who assist on our searches and project managers and all that stuff. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what about your podcast? How does that assist you, or is that just something you do as a labor of love to advise people or interview interesting people?
Well, first of all, it is indeed a labor of love, but I'll tell the story of how the podcast happened. So I'm a member of a real estate organization called the Urban Land Institute. And I am a contributor to the Urban Land Institute and a volunteer. And I was looking for volunteer opportunities for ULI about 5 or 6 years ago, and had been begging for an opportunity to do something interesting. And the head of the ULI Foundation said, I have an idea for you. You're complaining and you're really offering your help. Talk to this person named Ellen at the company. And so I called Ellen and said, I hear you might have a volunteer opportunity for me. And she said, well, let me ask you a question first. Do you listen to podcasts? And what are your favorite podcasts? And I said, Terry Gross and WTF and whatever. And so we talked about that. And she said, well, we're going to do a podcast for the Urban Land Institute. We're going to interview leaders in the real estate industry, and maybe you should be our host. Oh. And I almost started crying because I knew that was I got teary-eyed because A, I really wanted to do something special. B, I had hosted a radio show during college. And C, I interview people for a living.
Oh, you're perfect.
Right?
Yeah.
So this is a boom. And half of my interviews, most of my interviews, 90% of the interviews are with candidates. But the other 10% of the interviews are how I interview the management team when we start a search. Tell me about your company. What do you do? What's different about you? Why is your company great? Why are you great? Who are you? What do you like to work with? And so I'm interviewing not candidates, but companies and their leaders all the time. So I've been trained to do this. So when she said, give it a shot, I'm like, absolutely. So with ULI, we did 20 some odd episodes back 5 years ago. And then ULI decided it just didn't fit their business, didn't need this podcast, and I was able to take it over myself. So I've been producing it on my own now through 120 episodes in 5 years. And my goal is, it's clearly a labor of love. It's good for my business. It's established myself in the industry in a different way than I had before. I am creating a library of conversations that express to the average person particularly in the real estate business, what the breadth of our industry is. And so we talk about all sectors of real estate. We talk about all functions of real estate. We talk about all geographies of real estate and all different issues relating to real estate. So I've interviewed people from true icons in the real estate business, household names in real estate investment like Sam Zell, Gerald Hines, the founder of the largest architectural firm in the real estate business, Art Gensler. So many, half a dozen icon billionaire kind of people have been on the show. And it's been my privilege to interview them. But it's also been my privilege to interview the head of Parks and Recreation in New York City, Mitchell Silver, who's been the head of the American Planning Association.
Mm-hmm.
And that diversity of perspective, and Mitchell Silver is an African-American guy. So I'm talking to women, I'm talking to people of color, and again, providing many, many different perspectives on the real estate business. And I am on a mission to keep presenting those different perspectives. In part, what I want to do is offer pathways for young people getting into the real estate business to find inspiration for different careers in our business. Kind of last comment to that is last August, I started this, but I've done both. We do it we do 2 podcasts a month.
Mm-hmm.
Last August, because it's really hot where I live in Sonoma, and we have fires and we have environmental degradation. So I did 2 podcasts on the environment, climate change, and real estate. You probably don't know this, but 40% of global climate change comes from the built environment, whether we're building or it's the buildings that we live in or work and play in. So 40% of global carbon emissions are tied to real estate and the built environment.
No, I didn't know that.
So we did 2 podcasts last August on the subject, and we're doing 2 this year. And we just dropped one last week with the head of sustainability in the Americas for Lendlease, which is a global real estate investor and developer. And then my next one, someone who I interviewed in person in Copenhagen last week, is one of the world's authorities on bike transportation and bike commuting. Mm-hmm. And you probably also don't know this, but 60% of people in Copenhagen commute by bicycle year round in a country that has a lot of cold in the winter and rain and snow. 60% of people commute by cycle, and also their daytime in the winter is short. So they're commuting in the dark, 60% of the people, not in a car. So anyhow, he's the next guest. It's gonna be a really fun conversation.
Oh, that will be really fun. Well, that's the fun part about you being able to produce your own show. You can kind of take it where your passions are and things that you think are important to the world. And as you said, you are trying to help young people. So there's a lot of directions you can go.
Yeah, half is, leaders listening to leaders. And so I have a lot of leaders and senior people in the business who call and say, hey, great show. I really enjoyed that, really learned something. And then probably the other half for me, and the voice in my ear is really young people planning a career. And if it's a climate change person, they want to plan a career somewhere in the economy, let them come to real estate because we need their help.
Yeah. Oh gosh, this has been so interesting. It sounds like you have a passion for a lot of wonderful things. And I did notice that you're involved in a lot of charities. Are you still with the Extra Food organization?
I am. I'm no longer the chairman of the board, but I helped found an organization about 10 years ago with a really close friend who became the first executive director of a food recovery organization in Marin County, California. Food recovery is don't let food go into the landfill that's still good to eat. Right. And in Marin County, which is one of the wealthiest counties in the country, maybe top 3 or 4 wealthiest counties in the country, we have 20% people are food insecure. So think of 20% people food insecure in one of the wealthiest counties in the country. And so one of the things Extra Food is able to do, both from a climate change standpoint and a hunger standpoint and an equity standpoint, is to help divert some of that food from landfills and get them into the mouths of hungry people.
Yeah, what a great cause. And as you said, there's so much going to waste. And I felt the same way a bit in Santa Barbara. There is so much wealth, but you never know. You might be standing next to somebody at the grocery store who's sleeping in their car and doesn't have anything. So it's just a huge dichotomy between the people that live there.
Totally true. And it's interesting. One thing we found at Extra Food, and I'm going to mess up the statistic. I think 20% of the students who go to Marin Community College, I think they're homeless.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's or home insecure, right?
Right.
And so they're not living in a dorm because it's a commuter college, and they don't have dollars, so they're hungry and not fully involved in a rental somewhere, don't own their own home. And so how do you help those people who are going to college? They want to help themselves, right? But they could be standing right next to you in line in the grocery store. It's absolutely true.
Absolutely.
They probably are.
Yes, they probably are. Well, Matt, it has been so delightful. I didn't really know much about what you did, but you've done such an excellent job of describing it. And thank you so much for being on the Icons of Real Estate podcast. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Me too. Thank you, Patty.
Thank you.
And thank you to your listeners.
Okay, thank you so much.